All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Revelry. My name is Phil Grignota. I'm thankful to have you here for Easter Sunday. So, for all those that do practice and observe it, happy Easter. For everyone else, happy to the last day of March in 2024. We are here today with Dr. Shirley Green, who is the author of Revolutionary Blacks: Discovering the Frank Brothers, Freedom Men of Color, Soldiers of Independence, a great book published by West Home. So hopefully you can go get your copy. But today we are going to share the insight here with Shirley about, well, the making of this book, the personal connection. I did read one review that said you have to read the book to know which one she is a descendant of. So I'll leave
Yeah.
that up to her whether she wants to give that away. But appreciate you being on tonight, and I'll let you. If I missed anything with the introduction, I'll let you get started with a little background.
No, thank you. Thank you, Phil, first for inviting me to come on and speak about the book. And I'm talking from Toledo, Ohio. That's where I was born and raised.
Toledo. So Toledo, Ohio, where you're also a associate professor or adjunct professor of history. You're a veteran of law enforcement. You're
Yes,
the director of the police museum or law enforcement museum,
right.
an author, genealogist, and you sleep a little bit somewhere in between there, right?
Yeah, a little bit. It's the good thing is I teach part-time at the University of Toledo and then at Bowling Green State University. So I only have one class this semester. So that's a good thing. That's a good retirement gig. And I am the director of the Toledo Police Museum. Yes. So that keeps me awfully busy as well. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Appreciate we're Emerging Revolutionary War is a group of public historians, so we definitely understand the highs and lows and the joys and troubles of being a public historian.
Mhm.
But we also always looking for that personal connections to our ancestors, especially ones that served in such roles in the formation of this country. And so let's I guess start with the 50,000 foot view. How did you discover the Frank brothers?
So this is a really interesting story. And first off, I should probably say that my book is part microhistory, part family history. And when you talk about microhistory, you focus on a group of individuals, community, and event to tell a larger story. And there's always an interesting intersection between microhistory and family history. And my book is a product of that. But to get back to your original question, how did I come to learn about the Frank brothers? Like as I said earlier, I was born and raised in Toledo, Ohio, but my mother was not. My mother's from Lynn, Massachusetts, and her father is from Nova Scotia, Canada. And it was always very interesting to me to try to understand how we called him Pa, how Pa came to live in Nova Scotia, Canada. That is not a place that you think of African Americans or African Canadians living, right? And I was sitting in a undergraduate history class at the University of Toledo. I had the opportunity when I was still on the Toledo Police Department to go back to school to get my undergraduate degree because we got a new chief and he was going to reimburse us if we got good grades, right? So I'm like, all right, I'll go back and get my bachelor's degree in history. And so I'm taking this class at the University of Toledo, and the instructor, Dr. Nikki Taylor, who now teaches at Howard University in Washington, D.C., was talking about the first great wave of emancipation for Blacks after the American Revolution, during and after the American Revolution. And she started talking about a group of Black loyalists. And she mentioned that a large group of these Black loyalists um, evacuated from Long Island or New York at the end of the war, and some of them wound up in Nova Scotia, Canada. And when she mentioned that, my head popped up and I went, wait a minute, my grandfather's from Nova Scotia, Canada. So after class, I went up and asked her about it some more, asked her some more questions. And she responded by saying, well, is he a descendant of Black loyalists? And I told her I didn't know, did not know at all. So went home, called my mother, and asked her, and she says, "Oh no, Pa's people got to Nova Scotia, Canada, by way of the Underground Railroad." And I said, I don't think so. And so we called her older sister, which was really funny because my aunt, my mother's older sister, was living in Rhode Island, did not even know the Rhode Island connection at that time. So we called her and she said, oh no, Pa's people went to Nova Scotia by way of the Underground Railroad. And I said, I don't think so. So I called my Uncle Ben, who was still living in Lynn, Massachusetts at the time, and asked him, how did Pa's people get to Nova Scotia, Canada? And he said, I told you. I said, no, you didn't. And he said, okay, here's the story. And he proceeded to tell me the Franklin oral tradition, which goes something like this. The first Franklin came to the United States from the west coast of Africa by way of Haiti, eventually wound up living in Rhode Island, and two of his descendants fought in the Revolutionary War in the Black Regiment out of Rhode Island, and their last name was Frank. And then after the war, one of the Frank brothers eventually moved to Louisiana. And I said, okay, that's a great story. That still doesn't tell me how my grandfather's people got to Nova Scotia, Canada. And so that's when I started the investigation, trying to figure out, first off, trying to locate the Frank brothers. And then once I located them, trying to understand what their experiences were during the Revolutionary War. And then as I started to trace their activities during the war, found out that the younger brother, Ben, who is my direct ancestor, deserted during the war and eventually had to evacuate at the end of the war and wound up living in Nova Scotia, Canada. So that's the general story. But that's how it all started, just innocent conversation at the University of Toledo. And it just went from that to the rest of the book. Yeah.
It's amazing how something like that opportunity, the things that had to take into effect for you to be in
Mm-hmm.
that classroom at
Mm-hmm.
that time to hear that comment. It's what we love about nonfiction. You couldn't make that up. It's
No.
almost in the real. So on a sidebar conversation, where did the oral tradition come that they got to Canada by the Underground Railroad? Because obviously that starts at a later time. Is there any, or is that a different rabbit hole yet to explore yet?
I think what happened with that, it's the accepting the traditional narrative. I don't think my mother or my aunt really understood that we had a Franklin oral tradition. They just accepted the traditional narrative, which is what a lot of people do. They fall down that rabbit hole of not really investigating. Maybe your family might be a little unique to what the traditional narrative is. And that's what we did. We fell down that rabbit hole. When I was growing up, just assumed that my grandfather's people got to Canada by way of the Underground Railroad. Never asked him when he was still alive. I wish I had. Probably would have got the rest of the story. But I do know this, that my Uncle Ben knew the story. And his sisters, my mother and my aunt, did not know the story. So I came to an understanding that they passed the story along the male line, that the men knew the story, but the women didn't. Because my mother and my aunt did not know the story.
It's I
Which
mean, last few years I've unfortunately lost both my dad and my grandmother, but the oral tradition, like where you start to out of a death, it kind of starts to pull different threads. It's just very fascinating to find. There is always more to the story than meets the eye, I guess, as the popular saying goes. But with the Frank brother, the ancestry, even before the American Revolution, they did have a connection to, I guess, American military history, correct?
Right, correct, definitely. As I started to trace the Frank brothers and their own ancestry in Revolutionary America, I came to understand that
For one sec, folks, I think we might have lost her. We're going to try to bring her back. So we'll wait for her, Dr. Green, to get back on. She's having some technical difficulties here. So you're up there. She is. She's perfect. Popping back on there.
All right,
So
we're back.
yes,
They were back. We're back.
we're back.
I don't know where I left off. I was explaining about Rufus Frank and his service in the French and Indian War.
Yes, you had just started
He's
about her, yeah, or about him. Excuse me. Yes.
okay. Yeah, Rufus was the father of William and Ben Frank, and he lived in Providence um, during the time period of the French and Indian War, and he was a member of the Providence militia. And as such, he served on several campaigns throughout the war. He was stationed at Fort Stanwix for a period of time, and he also was part of the Havana expedition when Spain came into the war towards the end of the French Indian War. There were British forces along with American militia forces that went to Havana to lay siege to the port there and eventually won that siege. So, and he was part of that. I find him in payroll records for the different campaigns that he was involved in. So Rufus Frank and others, Frank men, were involved in colonial wars before the Revolutionary War.
And so, do they get recognized for their service? How does I mean? Do they pass down the tradition? How what happens after between the French and Indian War and the build up toward the American Revolution? Is there any information that you find in that period?
I with It's really interesting with the Frank brothers and their father and other Frank men that I find throughout the records. Just to give you an example, an idea of how I put together the Frank household in 1774, before the beginning of the American Revolution, before the beginning of the Revolutionary War. Um, I was able to find one of the brothers in military records early on, William Frank. He's the older brother. And William Frank lists his residence in a place called Johnston, Rhode Island. I find Ben Frank in a marriage document and list his place of residence in Johnston, Rhode Island. So I went back and looked at the colonial Rhode Island census of 1774 and found that there is only one Frank family that lives in Johnston, Rhode Island, and they're a family of color. And the head of that family is a guy by the name of Rufus Frank. So now I have identified their father, or at least the head of that household. And as such, I started to track him and found him in the French and Indian War records. Now there were other Frank men of that same generation who were listed in muster rolls for the French and Indian War. Rufus Frank, there's a Philip Frank, who I know Rufus and Philip are related somehow. I don't know exactly how. And then there is an Andrew Frank that's also listed as being a veteran of colonial wars. So you have this whole generation of Frank men who are already free during the time of the French and Indian War and even earlier, and who are already starting a tradition of military service along the Frank line.
And so, as this military line is established, the American Revolution kicks off.
Yeah.
But initially, there's a little pushback about accepting men of color into the units. Correct?
That is correct, which is it's interesting to me because in the militia that started with the fights as part of the Army of Cambridge and the army that George Washington whipped into shape that would eventually become the Continental Army. Out of the militia that fought at Lexington and Concord, there were Black soldiers. Those militia groups were integrated. In the Battle of Bunker Hill early in the war, those groups were integrated. But Washington believed that he could not have a professional army if they included Black soldiers. And of course, he was also concerned about the thoughts and feelings of Southern slaveholders and making sure that they stayed on board and would continue to back the Continental Army and the Continental Congress. So he was concerned about all that. So he issued a regulation stipulating to recruiting officers that they were not to enlist any Black soldiers into the Continental Army. And that would last for a period of time, for until the Royal Governor of Virginia, the Earl of Dunmore, John Murray, and he issued a proclamation in November of 1775. And basically, Dunmore's proclamation said that if you were an enslaved man and you came and were willing to bear arms for the British, then the British will give you your freedom. And he did. He was able to they're saying, historians estimate that anywhere from 80,000 to 100,000 enslaved Blacks ran to the British lines, starting with Dunmore's proclamation. And as these enslaved men ran to Dunmore's line, he put together something called the Ethiopian Regiment of around 800 soldiers that would fight in 2 battles against the Patriot forces. So Governor Murray does that out of Virginia. And of course, there has to be a reaction from the Continentals and from the Congress and George Washington to that. And George Washington does change his policy. He allows for the enlistment of Black veteran soldiers, meaning those soldiers who had fought as members of the Army of Observation, Army of Cambridge. The other thing is that those same veteran soldiers had their command officers, officers that commanded them in the past, go to Washington and really advocate for them, along with Prince Hall, who would become the leader of the Black Freemason movement in the United States. He also and other Black leaders went to Washington and pushed to allow for Black soldiers to fight. So Washington changed his policy in January after Dunmore's proclamation, and then a year later, he acquiesced and decided to allow all free Black men to fight. And that's when the Frank brothers could sign up.
So initially, the Frank brothers' first initiation into the Continental or was in the Continental Army. So they were not. I mean, they were militiamen before the war,
Mm-hmm.
but then
well, with William initially enlisted in the Rhode Island State Brigade in early 1777, and then later that spring he enlisted with the Rhode Island Regiment, the second Rhode Island Regiment of the Continental Army.
So I mean, the second, so they have a pretty famous commander, at least last name, right, from Rhode Island history. For those watching, if you don't know, this is probably heard this last name before, but maybe the first name might be slightly different. This is Christopher Green, correct? And he will be the commander, but he is also elected while he is not in Rhode Island, correct?
Correct. He was part of the Benedict Arnold expedition to Quebec that failed, and he was captured there, taken there as a prisoner of war. And he would be named to be in charge of the 1st Rhode Island Regiment while he was still captured. And then he would eventually be released, which was typical then, and he would take command of the 1st Rhode Island Regiment. But to back up just a little bit, the Rhode Island, of course, we all know is a small state. And they were asked to supply 2 infantry regiments as part of the Continental Army. Excuse me. And those regiments were the 1st and 2nd Rhode Island regiments. The 1st Rhode Island was commanded by Colonel Christopher Green, which we were just talking about. And the 2nd Rhode Island regiment was commanded by a guy by the name of Israel Angel, with 2 L's on the end of Angel. And the 2nd Rhode Island Regiment was initially the regiment that both Frank brothers served in.
And then what happens? And you do, I think, share this in your book. But what does happen to get them into the other Rhode Island regiment?
Well, the excuse me, their first year of serving with the 2nd Rhode Island Regiment, they fought in a pivotal battle of Red Bank in New Jersey, and they were under the command of Commander Israel. Excuse me. Then after that battle, they and the other Continental forces marched to Valley Forge, and that's the infamous Valley Forge winter of 1777 to 1778. That's the Van Steuben winter encampment, where von Steuben comes and kind of drills the American forces, and they become more professionalized. But during that really tough winter, there was a lot of loss of manpower due to disease, desertion, and because of that, the Rhode Island regiments, already being thin, they lost a number of men. And towards the end of, as they're making their way through the winter encampment, they realized that they did not have enough, they barely had enough soldiers left to have one regiment. And because of that, General Varnum, who's in charge of both the overall command of the Rhode Island regiments, went to George Washington in the Rhode Island State Assembly and said that they could possibly raise a regiment of enslaved men if they were allowed to do so. And that's the one thing that George Washington was not a big fan of. But because of the fact that they had lost so many men during this winter, they had no other recourse. So Varnum and others get the Rhode Island General Assembly to pass something called the Slave Enlistment Act, which they passed in February. Oh, I'm sure they didn't realize that February would have been Black History Month, but they passed in February of 1778, and then allowed for the enlistment of enslaved men. And once those enslaved men mustered with the Rhode Island Regiment, then they would gain their freedom. They decided that the person to be in charge of this new regiment would be Colonel Christopher Green. So Colonel Christopher Green was sent from Valley Forge with his command officers to Rhode Island to recruit enslaved men for the Rhode Island regiments. Now, once that happened, and they recruited over 100 men to serve in the Rhode Island regiments, once that happened, they decided to try something that military historian Robert, his name escapes me right now. I'll remember as I'm talking, Robert Wright. Robert Wright called an experiment in segregation. An experiment, quote, experiment in segregation, unquote. And what they did was they took all of the Native Americans and Black soldiers that were already in service with the Rhode Island regiments, including the Frank brothers who were in the 2nd Rhode Island, and transferred all of them to the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, and they were going to be in the same regiment as the formerly enslaved men. And that's when they became known as the Black Regiment. And then all of the white soldiers who were originally in the 1st Rhode Island Regiment under the command of Colonel Christopher Green were transferred to the 2nd Rhode Island Regiment under the command of Israel Angel. And that happened as a result of the Slave Enlistment Act. And I've looked a number of places to see if there is any reasoning or rationale behind this realignment. It's, for me, I noticed it in footnotes of secondary sources. And then, of course, I came across Robert Wright's book, who called it an experiment in segregation. And I cannot understand from any of the primary sources why the changes were made. Just that the change was made. There is a pension application by a white soldier who basically says that all of the white soldiers from the 1st were transferred to the 2nd. And he says, well, because Colonel Green lost a lot of men. But that still doesn't explain why this segregation took hold. But because of that, the Frank brothers were transferred from the 2nd to the 1st Rhode Island Regiment. And I mention that in the book I because they were freeborn and they came out of a free household in Johnston, Rhode Island, and their father was free and fought in the French and Indian War, and they have that history. And they initially were recruited and enlisted in integrated companies and integrated regiments, and always received the same pay, the same assignments, same discipline, I should say. Historian Ira Berlin says something about, very succinctly says, to understand how African Americans or Blacks were feeling during this period of time and how they chose who they would align themselves with. He explains that if you were enslaved, you would pick the side who would grant you your freedom and your liberty. If you were already free, you would pick the side who would give you equality. And for the Frank brothers, when they first signed up, they're in integrated companies, integrated regiments. They are now accustomed to, and they're both very young men, accustomed to the 2nd Rhode Island and being commanded by Colonel Israel Angel. And now they're being transferred to another battalion, another company. They would at one point serve in the same company together as well. And this is all broken down by race now for them. So that's how they wind up being under the command of Colonel Christopher Green and being attached to, and that's the origins of the Black Regiment.
So prior to that, do the Frank brothers leave any notes, letters about the engagement at Red Bank or their Valley Forge service, or are they just trying to survive? Because I mean, it is a tough winter for these men. And for me, I mean, after a whole day of exertion, you're probably not going to sit down and want to write too much. But just anything come of light?
No, I wish. Well, I've been conducting research on the Frank brothers for quite some time now. It started as a master's thesis, then a dissertation, and now the book. And with every step, I'm always adding new research to it, finding new sources and things of that matter. And one thing I can find is anything written by them. I would absolutely love to have something written by them to explain something to me. Even with William Frank, who is the older brother and did apply and did get a land bounty at the end of the war, there's like one piece of paper in his pension record, and that's it. So he doesn't even have a deposition or anything that he attests to, and that would have been really, really helpful. So I am, a lot of this is based on the Franklin oral tradition as told to me by my Uncle Benny, and everything he has told me, I have been able to prove either by DNA testing or by documents. Everything. He's been right about everything, which is amazing to me. Amazing.
That's what each family needs an uncle like Uncle Benny. That's right about everything. So
right about everything.
So if you are that uncle listening in, you heard that here first. But we so the Frank brothers go back to Rhode Island, and obviously with the service, correct? With the 2nd Rhode Island or the Black Regiment.
They're with the 1st Rhode Island, the Black Regiment. Yes.
And so they're there, and so are they at the battle? Because Green will lose his life in service in front, right? Are they there at that engagement as well?
Well, after the realignment and after that, the Valley Forge winter, they are involved in the Rhode Island expedition, and they fight at the Battle of Rhode Island. They are part of that battle. And that's the first battle that they fought as this new reconfigured Black Regiment. And then after that battle, they spend some time on what is classified as shore patrol in their home state of Rhode Island. And it's during this period of time that the younger brother, who is Ben, the brothers' names are William and Ben. I don't know if I've mentioned that yet, but William and Ben are the two brothers, and the older brother's name is William, and the youngest brother's name is Ben. And the younger brother, Ben, decides to get married while he's on shore patrol duty in his home state. And he gets married to a young woman by the name of Sarah Wilbur. And Sarah has a child. So so the younger brother Ben is dealing with all of that. And another winter encampment comes up, the winter encampment of 1779 to 1780. And for some reason or another, that winter is too much for Ben, and that is the winter that he decides to desert. And he leaves along with 15 other individuals that leave in the same year, in the year 1780. And those are some of the Black freeborn or previously free soldiers that served with Ben and William in the Black Regiment, in the 1st Rhode Island Regiment. And that was unusual for them to desert. Up to that point, only 2 of them had taken off. And during that winter and after segregation, the floodgates kind of open up, and 15 of them left. And it was after that this battle that you're talking about with Colonel Green takes place. Ben has already deserted. He is left. He is not returned. He doesn't return on his own. He's not recaptured. He just disappears from the records. His brother-in-law, a guy by the name of Solomon Watson, who was married to Ben's younger sister, Hannah, he also deserts at the same time, but he is retaken. And a year later, he dies in camp of disease. And then Ben's sister is now a widow. But after all of this happens, after that winter, the Rhode Island regiments lose more soldiers due to illness and desertion. They lose so many that they can only form one regiment. So they are consolidated into one regiment. They call it the Rhode Island Consolidated 1st and 2nd. And it is now under the command of Colonel Israel Angel, retires, and Colonel Green is now in charge of both regiments as they're consolidated together. One of the first things they do is they are assigned to Westchester County, New York. And they are assigned to just kind of patrol this neutral ground. They called it neutral ground. It really wasn't, but they were assigned to patrol this ground. And in this area was a group of soldiers, you want to call them that. They were called Delancey's Corps of Refugees. And they were led by this Colonel Delancey, and they were made up of native-born New Yorkers from Westchester County who were still loyal to the crown. They were still on the side of the king. And they were conducting guerrilla raids and stuff like that, and skirmishes and fighting with Patriot forces throughout that area in Westchester County, New York. And Colonel Green's regiment was assigned to keep all of that at bay. And they were also assigned to guard the bridges over the Hudson River in this area as well. And it's on one of these nights that Delancey's group ambushes the Rhode Island regiments. And they ambush Colonel Christopher Green at his headquarters. The headquarters, it was at the Davenport House, and he is killed there. He is attacked there. He is stabbed several times. Major Ebenezer Flagg is also there. They are attacked in the middle of the night. So Major Flagg is awakened, and he wakes up and he's trying to reach for his gun, and he gets shot while he's reaching for his gun at the foot of the bed. And there are several soldiers, the guard of Colonel Green, who were also killed during this ambush. And the thing with Colonel Green is he is really fatally stabbed at the house. But they drag his body, they tie him to a horse, and they drag his body down a road, and eventually let him go and toss his body to the side of the road. And members from his regiment find him the next morning. And there are some military historians, and I believe this is the case as well, that he was so badly, his body was so badly treated, Colonel Green's body was so badly treated. It was because he was in charge of black troops.
So
So
not only did he pay the ultimate price, but the indignity of the type of the ultimate price too.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
And then in warfare. But um, his death, I mean, doesn't stop the service or the action and so forth. So the one ancestor continues though to serve with the Rhode
right.
Island, what's left of them. Um, but they don't stay in Rhode Island, right? They do get pulled out
Yeah, yeah,
to end the war. So I found this fascinating as well because they seem to be at these momentous
yeah,
places at the right time.
yeah.
And so he does make it south to a little place called Yorktown, correct? And
Yes, he
you
does.
want to pick the story, any tidbits from of the story there?
Well, I know that Washington actually asked for the Rhode Island troops to come down and help lead um, at Yorktown. So they did march down. They are now being led by Commander Olney, which is a pretty famous name in Rhode Island circles as well. And William Frank is part of that. He and this group of consolidated Rhode Island troops all march down to Yorktown, and they take part in the battles, take part in the siege there. Some of them actually take part in a couple of major attacks on various strategic points of the British lines during Yorktown. So yeah, they are very well suited for the battle there, and they really do themselves well while they're at Yorktown. Yeah, they do. Uh, what is really in that is the last major battle of the war, right? But there are still British troops in some of the forts in upstate New York, and the Rhode Island Regiment was assigned to march to one of those forts, Fort Oswego, and make sure that the British troops were removed from the fort. And they begin the march there, but it's in winter. They lose their way in the snow, and that proves to be really deadly to some of the soldiers who die from being frozen to death and things of that nature. And they had to turn around and come back to main camp. And William Frank was part of that, but he survived that. So William Frank, the older brother, who signs up first um, to serve in the Revolutionary War, and then his younger brother Ben would sign in a month later, in 1777. But William survives all that. He survives the battle at Red Bank. He survives Valley Forge, even though at one point in time he was listed as being unfit for duty at Valley Forge, meaning he didn't have the right type of equipment, or maybe he didn't have shoes or something. He survives the Battle of Rhode Island. He survives the craziness in Westchester County, New York, when they are attacked by Delancey's corps. And he survives Yorktown and the fateful march to Fort Oswego. And he serves for over 6 years with the Continentals, and he is furloughed at the end of the war. And he goes back home to Johnston, Rhode Island. And he is captured in the first federal census, the 1790 federal census. William Frank is listed as living in basically his hometown of Johnston, Rhode Island.
And well, does he stay in Johnson, Rhode Island, or what happens post war?
No, well, he's a tricky one. Isn't that? It's always been interesting to me that it was always easier for me to track Ben Frank, who changes his name and leaves the country, um, and not William. But William, her family oral tradition, leaves Rhode Island and makes his way to Louisiana, and then I lose him in the records. Now, having said that, there are a number of Franks in the Louisiana records. I just don't know how they're related to William Frank, or if they are. There is a William Frank and a Ben Frank who are in the 1870 census in Louisiana. And I like to think that somehow or another they're related to the Frank family from Rhode Island, but I haven't been able to make that connection yet. So, yeah.
Meanwhile, the other Frank evacuates in 1783, correct?
Yes,
When New York
yes.
eventually falls, ends up in Nova Scotia. What happens to him then? Does he stay in Canada, or does he ever come back to what is now the United States?
He that's probably the trickiest part of the research, making the connection between Ben Frank and Ben Franklin, the name change. And he Ben Frank disappears from the records, the Ben Frank that I know. Um, and he pops up in the records again as being listed in the Book of Negroes, which was an inventory that was taken by the British at the end of the war to reimburse American slaveholders for the slaves that had ran to the British cause, right? And they took an inventory of all Blacks who were behind their lines at the end of the war. And in the Book of Negroes, I believe that Ben Frank is listed as an individual by the name of Ben Frankham, Frankham, and he's the same age as Ben Frank would be at that period of time. He, at the end of the war, he gets on a ship along with other loyalists, black and white, and they make their way to Nova Scotia, Canada. He arrives there and lives for a time in a little settlement called Port Mouton, in the southern tip of the Nova Scotia Peninsula. He eventually moves to what would become the largest free Black settlement in North America, by the name of Birchtown. There were over 1,500 Blacks, free Blacks that lived in Birchtown. And then he would eventually marry the daughter of another Black loyalist and settle in a place called Granville Ferry, Nova Scotia. And then my grandfather was born and raised in the same general area as Granville Ferry, Nova Scotia. Ben Frank, now known as Ben Franklin, would have he did move throughout the Nova Scotian Peninsula looking for farmland and a way to take care of his family. He would have the opportunity to move to Sierra Leone on the west coast of Africa. There was a movement among many of the Black loyalists living in Nova Scotia to better themselves by moving to West Africa because they were not getting the land and supplies that they were promised as a result of by the British during the war. So two-thirds of the Black loyalists that migrated to Nova Scotia, Canada at the end of the war, two-thirds of those individuals would move again and sail across the Atlantic and go to set up a settlement in Freetown, Sierra Leone. One of those individuals was a gentleman by the name of Henry, sometimes called Harry Washington, who was formerly enslaved by George Washington. But Ben Frank didn't. I think Ben was just tired of moving all over the place, and he just settled there. He settled in Nova Scotia, Canada, and stayed there for the rest of his life.
So these are the two revolutionary, of course, generation, but you do carry a little bit about the family history past that, correct? And there's a picture or two, not to give too much away from the book. There's a picture or two. I think that is your uncle
Yeah.
Benny. That is the one that
Yes.
so
Yes.
he also serves in the military,
Oh,
correct?
yes. Right. Correct. So, yeah, I think it really does. It starts with Rufus Frank in his service in the French and Indian War, and possibly Rufus's father, Philip. I'm not really sure about that, so I don't make that argument in the book that strongly. But it starts with Rufus, continues through his sons, William and Ben. And then after that, it continues with my grandfather, who was born and raised in Nova Scotia, Canada, the one I was trying to answer the question about. And his first job was on a whaling ship. And that's one of the first jobs Ben of his era had as teenagers. They would go down to Weymouth Falls and say, okay, I want to sign up on a whaler, and they would. and he got injured at some point, and the ship dropped him off in New York City, and he decided to stay. And while living in New York City, he was there at the outbreak of World War One. And when America decided to send troops for that war, my grandfather signed up to serve in World War One. And his older brother, who's still living in Nova Scotia, Canada, also served in World War One as well. So you see this pattern of brothers serving in the same war. And then my grandfather's two sons, who are named after the original William and Ben Frank. The older uncle is John William Franklin, and then Uncle Benny, who told me the story, is Ben Franklin. So they're named after the original Franklin brothers, which I don't think anyone ever really realized it. And they served in World War II and the Korean conflict.
A long line of Franks serving
Crazy.
the United
Yeah,
States in the military, and then obviously yourself serving in to protect the United States in a great
thank
law
you.
enforcement career. But what else would like to? It's so much that as historians we love to look at footnotes, look at the genealogy history, and that is one of I think the benefits of the of this book is you lay that history out and so forth in the end. Was that it? I have to ask this from someone who has published the book as well. Is that did you push that? Were you allowed to have that? Is that kept over from your dissertation? Um, or was that a fight to get that into the book? So give us a little bit of the nuts and bolts of the book.
I it's funny you asked that question, because the first time that I sat down to defend the thesis based on my family's oral tradition, there was some pushback. There was pushback by one of the members on my committee that maybe I should just kind of back burner the oral tradition stuff. And I said I couldn't do that because the oral tradition is the basis of the book, and I was able to prove most of what was stated in the Franklin oral tradition. So yeah, it was a little early on, but as time went on, and I think you're probably aware of this too, that oral traditions are starting to be accepted more and more anymore. And I know there are local historians and public historians who will push you to look at oral traditions as oral documents, just like a piece of paper would be something that you would use as a primary source, and oral traditions are as well, and especially the Franklin oral tradition, because as I said earlier, and I've said a couple of times over the past hour or so, is that I have been able to prove with a piece of paper or DNA testing that the Franklin oral tradition is true. And I think that's the other thing that is helpful now with DNA. When my uncle Ben was still alive, I asked him to give me a DNA sample. Um, I did some research, and at the period of time, it was early 2000s, so this is before Ancestry DNA got into the mix. But I selected the largest DNA held based testing facility out there, and sent in his test. And it came back that he was a match for a young man who lived on the west coast of Africa in the country of present day Togo. And he was also a match for an individual who lived in the Dominican Republic. So that, yeah, that really makes the connection from the west coast of Africa by way of Haiti to Rhode Island. Because by the time we get to Rhode Island, I can find documentary evidence. So everything that my Uncle Ben told me was he would be so happy, to be honest with you, that he was absolutely right. Yeah. But you're right. There was early on some pushback about making the oral tradition of the Franklin family the crux, the focal point, the entry to family history and to this book and to my dissertation and now the book. But I think more and more people are really starting to understand and appreciate family histories and genealogy. You have to give a shout out to Dr. Henry Louis Gates, I think, for that, finding your roots in some of the TV shows that are out there. And if you delve into your own family history, it's a way to what genealogists do and what I try to do and microhistorians try to do is contextualize someone's family history, right? So you not only learn about your own family history, you learn about all the other things that are going on around your family, and you get to a better understanding, to me, of American history. So I think that's really what's important when you talk about family history and genealogy.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, especially at that time frame, the American Revolution, when you don't have a very literate population. I get asked all the time when I'm speaking, what's one, because I do both American Civil War and Revolutionary War engagements, like what's the difference? Well, I wish more people would be able to read and write in the Revolution because the amount
Yeah,
of documentary evidence we have in the Civil War. That, and if
right.
someone had a camera too, that would have been great to take some pictures. But um, or antibiotics, I guess that would help both wars. But
Right.
um, with that, I'd like to, we're getting down here near the end of the hour. But
Okay, great.
so the book is out. If people, what's if you had someone came up to you and said, "What's the one thing that they should take away from this book that is the most important?" Boil it down. What's that one overarching theme or point or word of advice? Leave it open ended. Anything that you would like to add?
I think the one of the reasons I wrote the book was for people to have an understanding that there are different stories out there, that we shouldn't just understand black service during the Revolutionary War as enslaved men trying to gain their freedom. There was a whole other population of previously free or freeborn black men who were serving um, even as early as the French and Indian War, and even before that, as part of American military service and military history. And that's what I would love for people to take away from that, that Black military service pushes all the way back to before we were even a country. And people need to understand that and learn that aspect of our history.
Is that at times reading the book, it was just, I mean, they're the accounts, they are under fire, they are
Yeah,
freezing, they are
yeah, oh
trying to
yeah.
make their way. They are,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's just, it is an amazing story. So I'd really appreciate, it was I mean, a great read. I'd probably ignored family obligations or whatever else to finish the
Oh,
book. But
thank you. Thank you very much.
if if people wanted to, so I know they can go to West Home Publishing and get
Yes.
a copy of the book. Is there any speaking engagements upcoming or any other book talks?
Yes, I am speaking in Washington, D.C. In April. I should probably be able to tell you the exact date. I don't know off the top of my head, at the Institute of the American Revolution. And if you bear with me just a second, I'll tell you exactly what it is. Can't do anything without your phone anymore, right?
No, no, and
Phone is your life. Um, I am speaking at the Institute of the American Revolution on April the 16th.
sorry, April the
That
16th, Institute
that's in Washington, D.C.
in Washington, D.C., April 16th. So if you want to go see Dr. Green in person, April 16th, Institute of the American Revolution, you can probably go to their website, see it. I'm only about an hour up the road, so I'll have to
Oh
check my
wow.
calendar, see if I can make my way down. I'm in Frederick. I'm a Baltimore Orioles fan, if you couldn't tell, but
Yeah, I could
uh,
tell. How are they going to do this
um,
year?
they're hopefully they're going to do well. I went to the game last night. They're 2-1. I'll take it.
Okay. All
Um,
righty.
but also I think as well, you're speaking in Fort Plain at the conference
Yes.
up there in June. Brian Mack is a good friend of the Emerging Revolutionary War Group, so I wanted to give him
Right.
a shout out as well. So
That's
there's
June 14th, that weekend. Yep.
June
Hmm.
the 14th. So either Fort Plain in New York, in our nation's capital, Washington D.C., April 16th.
Yep.
There'll be a chance to either get, if you have a copy of the book, have her sign it. I know Brian Mack will have them for sale in New York as well. But otherwise, I would like to thank once again Dr. Reen for
No
meeting and
problem.
hanging out with us tonight, talking about our book, Revolutionary Blacks: Discovering the Frank Brothers Freeborn, Men of Color, and Soldiers of the Independence. And you can see I have some of my post-it notes still in there as well. For those that are interested as well, we will be returning in 2 weeks, April 14th at 7 p.m. Red War Revelry. We'll be talking the Battle of Paoli with historian and author Michael C. Harris. We also have, if you want to see where some of these free men of color and former enslaved African Americans fought, Lexington and Concord, we are doing the fourth annual Emerging Revolutionary War bus tour, October of 2024. About I was told before I came on by my co-founder, Rob Orson, we have 8 tickets remaining out of 52. So go over to emergingrevolutionarywar.org to secure a ticket there. But once again, thank you, Dr. Green, for joining us
No problem.
here tonight. We hope everyone enjoys the rest of their Sunday evening, and we'll see you back here in 2 weeks.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for having me.